Hello, my name is Erwin Lazar, Vice President and Service Director here at Nemertes Research, and welcome to our monthly webinar entitled Better, Faster, Stronger, the Nemertes 2016 Cloud Data Center and SD-WAN Benchmark, presented by John Burke, Principal Research Analyst. This webinar consists of an interactive presentation and moderated Q&A period. To submit a question, please use the control panel on the GoToWebinar application. If you experience any technical difficulties, please contact webinars@nemertes.com. Upon conclusion, we'll provide you with a short survey. Please do fill this out as it gives us feedback on this webinar, as well as suggestions for topics for future webinars. We'll also ask if you'd like to participate in our research. If you're willing to spend an hour on the phone with us occasionally or take a survey from time to time, we will share with you the results of the research, including often checklists and scorecards to help you evaluate where you are with respect to your peers. We will make a replay available typically within a week, and so if you are unable to stay on for all of this, or you want to share the replay of the webinar with your friends and co-workers, we will distribute that link, like I said, in about a week. So with that, let's go ahead and get started, and I will turn it over to John Burke. John, take it away.
Thanks very much, Erwin. And hello, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Better, Faster, Stronger. This is the first presentation of results from the 2016 Cloud Data Center and SD-WAN benchmark. There's a lot of material still hidden inside the data set. It's not all going to fit into this deck and in a 30 to 40-minute webinar, but we'll keep unpacking it session by session. Next month, we'll be covering a cost model on the SD-WAN data, and that'll be the next big dip into this. So we'll start by introducing Nemertes for those of you who aren't familiar with us, and then walk through the demographics of the benchmark, and then dip into the technology areas, starting with the hybrid cloud, public, private, and our cloud maturity model. We'll look quickly at containers, at the state of SDN in the enterprise, and SD-WAN as a teaser for that fuller presentation next month in the cost model session, and then we'll wrap it up with some high-level recommendations and take questions and answers. So for those of you not familiar with us, Nemertes is a research and strategic consulting firm that is focused on finding the business value that companies derive by deploying emerging technologies. We cover a broad variety of topics and deliver the information that we are able to gather in a number of formats, ranging from webinars like this one to very, very in-depth strategy sessions with clients. Our main mode for research is to discuss, the analysts like myself or Erwin get on the phone and discuss with IT practitioners what they and their companies are actually doing with emerging technologies to gather both quantitative and qualitative information to put real context around the numbers that we derive and to help us identify best practices and success practices. Each year we host a technology conference, Navigator 360, and this year it is July 25th, 26th, and 27th in St. Pete Beach, Florida, as usual at the Lowe's Don Cesar. And this year we're going to be talking about broadly how IT leaders can lead the digital enterprise transformation, and we'll touch on a number of topics ranging from collaboration tools and unified communications technologies to agile, lean, and DevOps methodologies and how they apply not just in software development but across the organization. If you're interested in joining us at N360, please reach out to client services at nemertes.com. So the benchmark, this time around, focused on cloud data center and SDN/SD-WAN technologies. We spoke with 37 organizations in the spring of this year with, for those of you who are familiar with our benchmarks, the usual mix of participant titles, ranging from mostly C-level, VP level, and architect, senior architect types, through directors and managers, and even the odd engineer or systems consultant. By vertical, we had a stronger presence in manufacturing this year than in previous years, with a very strong presence, as usual, of financial services companies, and a pretty spread out mix of the rest of the companies participating: educational organizations, professional services companies, publishing and media companies. A notable shift this year, and I'll apologize for the shift in the color scheme, a notable shift this year is that the preponderance, actually the outright majority of our participants, to a larger degree than last year, are on the aggressive side of our IT culture scale. For those of you who are familiar with or unfamiliar with it, we ask companies to self-rate themselves on the culture of their company around IT, ranging from the very conservative companies where every IT decision is weighed pretty much solely in terms of whether it will reduce IT spend or otherwise reduce costs for the company, and do so in a fairly short time frame, all the way through the bleeding edge of companies. On the aggressive side, companies see IT as a strategic investment. At the bleeding edge, they reach out to partners and help develop new technologies that will help them gain a sustained advantage over their competitors in the same space. So in the past, it was split fairly evenly, almost 50-50, between the conservative half and the aggressive half of the circle, if you will. This year, it's leaned a little more definitively into the aggressive. And that's good, because it means more of the folks that we're talking to are using more of the emerging technologies that we're interested in finding out more about. Likewise, there's been a slight shift in the participants when judged by size in terms of revenues. And it's just that the mid-size companies have shrunk as a share of our participant pool. We've got more folks in the small category, under $300 million in revenues, and more folks in the large and very large category, which is from $1 billion in annual revenues and up, very large being $10 billion and up. So again, this gives us a better window into the use of emerging technologies, as we've seen repeatedly in years past, that although mid-sized companies face most of the same challenges as large companies, they often don't have IT resources that have scaled with the size of their challenges, and so they tend to have a resource mix that's more similar to smaller companies, and they tend to get very, very deeply bogged down in keeping the wheels on, and often don't get to deploy emerging technologies until they've become much more standard fare for the enterprise. Whereas small companies often will dive in with an emerging technology because they don't have a big data center investment, or sometimes even any data center investment at this point, and are often ahead of the curve on deploying compared to the mid-sized companies. So the hybrid cloud is a subject, of course, of enduring interest to us. We've been researching it for 6 years almost, and it's interesting that this year we've seen some fairly significant shifts in the actual deployment of one part of the hybrid cloud, which is, of course, the private cloud. In the past, many folks, I think the majority in every instance when we asked, said, yes, we have a private cloud, but in point of fact, if you scratched below the surface, what they had was a heavily virtualized data center. What they did not have was any variety of cloud management platform that was helping tie all the pieces together, bring the separate silos of virtualized resources more fully together, and orchestrating across them and providing a platform for consistent automation in the environment. So what we've seen is that now more than a quarter of the companies that we talked to this year have deployed a cloud management platform, and that if you throw in the folks who are getting ready to roll it out right now, many of them said they would have it deployed by June, by July. You're looking at a third of companies now in the private cloud business, if you will. That's a decisive improvement over years past, and it led us, of course, also to ask the follow-on question, which is, what are you using as your cloud management platform? And the number one option that people selected and are deploying or have deployed is the vRealize suite from VMware. No major surprise there, given VMware's footprint in the virtualization, the cloud resource management space inside the data center. And the fact that vRealize is a set of tools that are more mature in many instances than some of the competing offerings that are out there, some but not all, of course. What was a bit of a surprise was that OpenStack was a fairly small slice of the pie compared to custom, for example, where people had rolled their own because they needed cloud management functions well before the commercial offerings were viable for them, and other being a grab bag of options ranging from management company tools from BMC or HP, all the way to very new offerings, for instance, ServiceNow, which basically offers as-a-service cloud management. OpenStack, which is the open source, free and open source option that's available, still out there in a very small number of shops currently. And part of the reason is that a lot of the larger companies in the benchmark had tried OpenStack in the past. They tried it and found it wanting. It was too much work for them to manage the management infrastructure with OpenStack, or even to get it implemented stably and scalably. And so they moved on to something else. Either they wrote their own, or they deployed BMC or vRealize. And of course, we've seen OpenStack maturing extremely rapidly in the last 2 years. And so folks who are trying it now are having a very different experience of it than folks who initially tried it a couple of years ago. We expect the slice of OpenStack there to increase in size as it begins to rival in function and stability tools people built for themselves, or as it begins to, during refresh cycles, potentially replace what's underneath something like a BMC or an HP Cloud Manager. Use of public infrastructure as a service is continuing to climb. This is production deployment, so people actually putting enterprise workloads out there. And in the past, we saw numbers just north of 50% on this. So now we're past 60%, in part reflecting that more aggressive participant pool, in part reflecting people's growing comfort levels with this. What is still very, very important to keep in mind is that this is a relatively small slice of the overall enterprise workload pie. We're talking still about less than 10% of the workload on average, and that is climbing rapidly, but still will be less than 20% of the overall workload, again on average, by the end of 2017. Within that average, of course, hides a huge variance in investment, if you will, in public IaaS. We see folks who have 1% or less than 1% of the enterprise workload out there. That's typically the large, very large enterprises. And we see folks who have 50, 60, 75% of the workload out there, and that's typically small companies or at the small end of the large enterprise. We do hear a lot of very ambitious plans to move things out. That's why you're seeing the amount of work out there more than double by the end of 2017. We'll see how folks follow through with those as we follow this thread in next year's benchmark. With Paas, we see a similar state of affairs. We see just shy of 50% of companies either using it or planning on deploying it yet this year. And again, that's typically summer deployments in the conversations that we were having. They were talking about deploying in June, July. This was not something they were saying, oh, maybe someday. They've got their project plan in place, and they're marching through it and are ready to push workloads, .NET stuff out into Azure, or more often Java or other kinds of applications out into the Amazon Web Services space. Those are consistently the two destinations that we're hearing folks talking about, even though Google's out there, IBM's out there, others are out there. Still, the vast majority of the conversations we have are circling around Azure and AWS as a platform for public Paas. An even smaller slice of the overall workload out there in Paas, a faster growth pattern projected as a result. Starting from 3%, you've got a lot of room to grow and still be just over 10% of the overall enterprise pie by the end of 2017. So the hybrid cloud, a prerequisite for having a real hybrid cloud where you can smoothly take advantage of resources inside and outside, and you've got a cloud inside and a cloud outside, is some kind of integration at the provisioning level. And so we asked folks about their use of cloud service brokers, and it's a fairly small slice of the overall enterprise space right now. Just 16% or so plan to have this in place by the end of this year. A much larger chunk are evaluating their options there, and of course their options are changing rapidly as, again, folks like management vendors like BMC or HP beef up the multi-platform aspects of their cloud management platforms, as people like ServiceNow and RightScale continue to push the multi-cloud aspects of their platforms, and as VMware continues to expand the reach of vRealize especially. So we expect to see this number actually ramp up more quickly than the large slice of evaluating folks, but the absent slice of planning in 2017 folks would suggest. We think a lot of folks are going to move from evaluation to use in a very short time frame as they get more comfortable with cloud management of their own resources and want to immediately close the gap between provisioning things in-house and provisioning things outside their own walls. So we've started to assess cloud maturity by looking at a number of factors, and we'll probably have a deeper dive on the cloud maturity model in a later webinar. But for the moment, we've looked at three major components of function. People's approach to the cloud with respect to developing strategies and laying out technology roadmaps, people's approach to budgeting and organization and management of their use of cloud, and people's use of specific cloud technologies in the state of their technology environment for private cloud. So in looking at this, with respect to the strategy and roadmap aspect of using cloud. Strategy, what's your overall approach? When are you going to use internal resources? When are you going to use external resources? What are the criteria you're using to judge? And are you applying them consistently? That all rolls into having a cloud strategy and an integrated strategy for deploying your next workload, making the decision about where that goes and why. Having a strategy refresh cycle that's long enough but not too long. If you're reevaluating your cloud strategy every month, you're not thinking strategically. If you're not looking at your cloud strategy at least once a year, then you're not looking at cloud, because what you can do in the cloud changes rapidly enough that you need to have a fairly brisk review cycle on cloud strategy. Likewise, a cloud roadmap, you need to have something that's not less than a month, but not more than a couple of years. And so looking at all these aspects together, we can see that folks are doing better in some respects. They're doing better on having a strategy. In the past, most of the folks we talked to did not have a cloud strategy. That's no longer the case. On the other hand, it's often still a distinct strategy from their internal data center strategies, and bringing those two things together is a mark of maturity in making use of cloud, because it means you're really starting to think hybrid cloud. And so these are overall averages, and of course, as we look at individuals, we see a much different shape to the radar sweep for them. They may have a great strategy, but no roadmap laid out yet. They may still be bogged down in the idea of even developing a cloud roadmap. So there's a lot of variation for individual companies on this score. Likewise, in budgeting and management, on average, it looks like people are doing pretty well. They've got a locus of cloud oversight in their organization that's identified. They know who to talk to if they need to talk about use of cloud overall. They have a budgeting model that brings budgeting for use of external cloud services together with budgeting for internal resources, because, of course, it's all about how you meet the needs of the organization, and you need to budget in coordination. And we see a little less success with having a cloud-focused approach to security. A fair number of folks out there aren't making any special consideration of the fact that they're doing things in the cloud, they're doing things externally, and they're not making use of any of the available layers of additional security functionality that they might, old options like virtualized firewalls they could run inside their space, new options, or newer options, I should say, like CASB's Cloud Access Security Brokers. And so we see a slightly lower score there overall. And again, for each individual organization responding, a lot of variation from point to point. And on the technology environment side, we see, for example, very high level of use or intent this year to deploy, I shouldn't say deploy, to use their cloud management platform to provision workloads externally as well as internally. That's CMP for external. We see a fairly strong overall performance on having a private cloud, so deploying a cloud management platform, et cetera. Where we see a fairly weak performance, and this is extremely evident when you read through the notes of the conversations, is in having a consistent automation environment within which you can automate the function of your data center. So not just having a cloud management platform, but having coding standards and code management and change management around automation scripting. That was probably the biggest shock I got when I was interviewing companies. Describe your automation environment, and pulling in on details. We do versioning on these things. We check them in, we check them out. We have code management platform out there we use for this, GitHub or something like it. But when asked, do they do change management on these new versions of the automation, so actually putting them into production, the answer was actually no. Typically, there's no change management around pushing a modified version of a script into production, which was, to me, almost chilling to think about how much people are trying to rely on automation and how little they're treating it as sort of a first-class citizen of their data center. So that's a place where we see a lot of companies with a lot of improvement to make. So bringing those things all together, rolling up those separate areas of scoring for strategy, for management maturity, for private cloud maturity, we see, folks are roughly in the middle of the road. If you just look at the averages, things don't look too bad. But of course, if you look again at individual companies, you'll see that the triangles are considerably deformed, and they may have really excellent scores on management maturity, for example, and pretty abysmal ones on strategy and roadmap, or vice versa. So turning our attention more towards the resource level, we've been following the deployment of converged infrastructure for a few years, and we've seen a very slow but steady growth in the number of companies that are making use of it. It's approaching half the companies out there. If people follow through with their plans for deployment this year, it will be half of the companies out there using it. But what's been interesting is that it's almost never being brought in just as the general purpose platform for all workloads. you know, some folks, yes, that is exactly their goal. Their goal is to have a private cloud with a uniform infrastructure that all the workloads run on, you know, in the model of Google or Amazon. But in point of fact, usually converged infrastructure instances are being brought in to meet the needs of a specific workload or a specific subset of users rather than for general purpose compute. And so we hear complaints from folks about underutilization of the resources, about siloized resource pools that make it difficult for them to get as much value out of that investment, because it's usually a more expensive infrastructure on a per cycle, per gigabyte basis than they would like, because they're partitioned at a logical level rather than a physical level. And that's a conundrum. They can't get the value out of it that they want, but they won't let themselves turn it into the general platform. Sometimes that's because they don't have the economics in hand. They can't scale in the units they need to scale in. Sometimes it's because there have been schisms, rifts in the staff, and you know, the sysadmins and the network admins may be on board with shifting everything into the converged infrastructure, but the storage admins may be fighting it tooth and nail, or you know, substitute storage for network or network for systems administrators. The point is, if there's still a factionalized and contentious relationship between the managers of the resource silos, it becomes very difficult to push an agenda that brings all that function together. And that's a thing that many companies that are trying to use this technology are now wrestling with. We also heard for the first time this year a fair number of complaints about the platforms themselves not quite living up to expectations in terms of pre-integration of components, in terms of pre-testing of patches and the like, so that folks were in ways they had hoped to avoid, wrestling with things like rolling out firmware patches or plugging in new components that were part of the solution. So we're going to keep an eye on that. Hopefully it's just some kind of growth bump, and the vendors will get that ironed back out for the next cycle of this technology. Of course, at the far end of that spectrum, the hyper-converged vendors are out there making a lot of noise in the marketplace, and lots of people are paying attention. And so we see that almost half the companies out there are evaluating hyper-converged infrastructures. But we see very few people actually deploying it yet. And although a lot are planning on it in this calendar year, these were mostly folks who didn't have oh yeah, I'm rolling this out in June kind of plan for 2016. What they said was, we think we're going to be deploying those. We're going to be deploying those yet this year. We're going to be deploying those in our branch offices in X, Y, and Z geographies. But they didn't, you know, they didn't have the vendor picked out yet, and they didn't have purchase orders, you know, sitting around waiting to be filled. So it's a little more distant prospect for some of these folks who are planning to deploy this year. And interestingly, again, nobody planning to deploy next year. So that suggests that a lot of the folks who are in the evaluating pool may jump from there directly into deployment next year. We'll see where we get. So moving a little further afield and leaving private cloud per se for other data center topics, let's take a quick look at containers and SDN and SD-WAN ultimately before we jump to questions. So containers, almost 20% of the companies out there now making some, although typically very limited and very tightly defined, use of containers. And the folks who mean to use them this year are using them at this point. We didn't have anybody say, yeah, I'm planning on rolling that out later this year. We did have a significant chunk say next year. Surprisingly, a very small slice of folks evaluating this, and a lot, almost 2/3, who say they've got no plans for containers at all. We think that this has a lot to do with people thinking of containers as a way to package up applications that they develop for themselves, and that as vendors increasingly offer deployment in containers as a supported option for their packaged software, we'll see the numbers adopting and the numbers evaluating shoot up very quickly. Almost everybody who's deploying containers currently is deploying Docker, and that is not likely to change in the near term. It is far and away the system with the biggest ecosystem, the largest experienced labor pool, and arguably the highest level of maturity of the container platforms that are available. Now, they do, of course, kind of go hand in glove in most organizations with using a DevOps approach to developing solutions, and so we thought we'd take a look and see. Right now, we had just shy of a quarter of the organizations that we spoke to say, yeah, we're doing DevOps in our development efforts now, and of the folks who are doing DevOps, 40% of them are also doing containers currently, or they will be doing containers another 20% next year. So the storyline that if you're doing DevOps, you should be doing containers is getting a lot of play, and the idea that containers and development are closely intertwined is still very strong out there. Taking a look at SDN, again, this is something we started asking about, I think, back in 2011, maybe 2012. 2012, it was the year after OpenFlow 1.1 came out, so 2012. And we never saw any kind of high level of uptake of SDN in the past. We're still not seeing a high level of uptake on it now, surprisingly. Fewer than 10% of the organizations we talk to with it in production. And another 15%, though, planning on putting it in production yet this year. It's a mixed bag in the planning side. A significant number of these folks are, again, deploying in June, deploying in July. It's up and running in their pre-production environments. It's running in a way that satisfies them that they can deploy it in production, and it's on their calendar now. So, however, a fair number of folks are on the other side of that slice, if you will, and they have a project plan in place that's supposed to get them to deploying this by, winter, December-ish, but they haven't yet hit that level of comfort where they could move the date up, say, and deploy it sooner. They haven't yet hit that level of comfort in their pre-production environments where they're confident that they're going to hit that deployment this year. So it's the plan, but there's a lower level of confidence that they're going to be able to follow through on that. The interesting thing about which platforms people are implementing is that even though OpenFlow kind of broke open the floodgates of interest in SDN, nobody that we spoke to is deploying OpenFlow-based technologies in their data centers in production now. We think that's going to change. We think it's going to change at least on the monitoring, management, and security side of things, even if it doesn't for just baseline data moving around in the data center. Instead, we see most folks deploying either NSX or ACI, 60% NSX currently, 40% ACI. We did have a few folks say that they were contemplating doing both, but they had not yet tested that in production. One person said they were absolutely planning on doing that, but they were not willing to nail down a date. So again, given VMware's footprint in the data center, a large presence of NSX is no surprise. Given the enterprise interest in deploying SDN is driven by the desire to micro-segment their data center networks, again, no surprise, NSX is there and in most ways leading in that deployment race so far. The idea that you can very tightly control who can talk to who and integrate that into how you're deploying workloads in the data center ongoing is of enormous interest to folks who realize that, and this is a realization everybody needs to come to at some point, security at the perimeter of your data center is never 100%. Systems are going to get compromised, and so your second level of defense, if you will, should be compartmentalizing the workloads in your data center as much as possible, so that a breach in any one doesn't open up the entire data center or huge portions of it to compromise, and instead opens up, a very limited array of next targets for the compromised host to be used to attack. Microsegmentation of huge interest, still far too manual for the folks who we spoke to in our benchmark, and so they're still looking for a higher level of automation for that specific use case in their data centers. And looking outside the data center and at connecting internal resources to cloud resources, we asked this year for the first time about use of direct connect technologies. This is typically done either at the WAN edge or in a co-location facility somewhere like an Equinix data center. The idea being that your WAN edge, whether it's your MPLS cloud or an actual router that you put in a data center somewhere, gets a cable pulled from it over to a router that belongs to Amazon or Azure or one of the other major cloud environments, and that from that point on you can send traffic back and forth to that cloud provider without using the public internet and all of its exciting variation in performance. So 20% of the companies we spoke to using that now, another 13% planning on it in the coming year here, almost half evaluating it. And evaluating is a good place to be with respect to Direct Connect right now, because in addition to an expanding number of vendors willing to offer you the service of direct connecting to your cloud providers, and an expanding pool of cloud providers offering direct connect from their side, there's a growing number of WAN cloud exchanges out there. The idea being that instead of directly connecting your edge to your cloud service provider's edge, you connect yourself to an exchange. And the exchange is connected to all your cloud service providers, and you just spin up virtual circuits between your infrastructure and their infrastructure. It is a lower amount of work to get that done. It is faster to get that done. Once you're connected to the exchange, many of the exchanges, you can spin up new connections to cloud providers in minutes, even in a minute in some cases, as opposed to cutting a work order and getting a connection pulled. And if you get tired of using it or decide you don't want to use it anymore, or the economics of it don't work for you, or you stop using that cloud service provider, you can drop the virtual circuit essentially instantaneously, as opposed to having to deprovision a physical link. So we only see about 7% of the companies we talk to making use of exchanges currently, only another 10% looking at them now, relatively new offerings in the marketplace. The economics are tricky, and so a lot of folks can't see where this is going to be a win for them. They make use of one cloud provider and stick with that cloud provider. So for them, the agility angle is not so beneficial, and they understand their traffic flows very well, and the economics of the direct connect make more sense for them. So they're having a direct connection pulled instead. So a lot of folks evaluating exchanges. We'll see where that goes in the coming year. SD-WAN, on the other hand, is something where already 20 companies we're talking to using it, another 9% planning for this year, and over a third currently evaluating. The idea with SD-WAN is to let people mix and match the connectivity types they want in order to get both more bandwidth and better performance in their various branch locations, while at the same time, if all possible, saving money, sometimes displacing expensive MPLS type links with less expensive Ethernet or much less expensive commodity broadband, sometimes simply shifting the growth onto these lower cost options, but keeping their MPLS backbone in place. The idea, though, is I'll mix and match my connectivity, and I will rely on this SD-WAN solution to abstract many of the details of how I'm hooked up at the branch and just present me with a pool of bandwidth that I can then slice up as I need to into one or more virtual WANs overlaid on that connectivity pool, and manage the whole thing centrally by defining policies about which kinds of traffic flow how, which topology they'll flow across among the branches, between the branches and the data centers, between the branches and the public internet. And to manage that whole WAN as a unit by means of these centralized policies, rather than by managing it by device configuration of the individual sites' appliances. We expect to see a very, very rapid growth in the use of SD-WAN in the coming year, based on the intentness of interest from those folks who are evaluating solutions currently, and the very rapid maturation of these solutions, whether it's newcomers to the market, the WAN-Clouds and Viptelas of the world, tried and true enterprise partner vendors, Cisco's, Riverbeds, Silver Peaks, folks like that, or carrier-based options that are starting to hit the market this year from folks like AT&T or Verizon. Oop, and look who forgot to title a slide. As I mentioned, a lot of folks are interested in reducing the cost of meeting their growing needs for bandwidth in the branch. Most of them are not yet ready to drop MPLS, but a lot of them are looking to cap their spend on it or even cap their capacity on it and hope that cost reductions in capacity or per unit of capacity will gradually erode their spend in MPLS while they do all their growing on cheaper media. A few, though, 20% plus, do plan on dropping MPLS within a specific time frame, whether it's the next 3 years or the next 10. And the folks who have deployed, 2/3 of them have gone to the trouble of quantifying the benefits that they've realized, and those benefits are pretty substantial. Near elimination of WAN trouble tickets, for example, and if you're used to getting a ticket or two a day from a handful of sites, having those all go away can be a real boon to your network engineers, and of course a reduction in WAN outages as well. And where sites are able to have 2 or more links available to them, usually one MPLS and one not, people report essentially complete elimination of outages in most cases. Not all, but most. We had more than one person say the only outages they have now are essentially regional power failures, and everything else stays up all the time. So on this first run through, focus on shoring up the weak parts of your cloud game. Look at how you're doing with organization and budgeting, how you're doing with strategy and roadmap, and how you're doing with filling out and really getting mature in the technology environment that you're using as your part of the hybrid cloud that you are building yourself into. With each refresh cycle in your data center or in your branches, re-examine both converged and hyperconverged resource options, and keep containers, and Docker specifically for containers, on, or even if you're not a shop that's heavily into solution development on your own, it's going to become a very standard deployment technology for prepackaged solutions. We're already seeing vendors either ship a version for release in containers, or at least saying that they'll support deployment in containers, Docker containers usually. So this is something that will be in everybody's technology menu within a few years for reasons of efficiency, if nothing else. And it's beholden on everybody to explore their WAN needs and the options that SD-WAN presents for them to potentially save money or at least cap their spending, and to improve the performance, the reliability of their wide area network for their end users. For folks who are interested in diving further into this, clients, please contact client services. Non-clients can reach out to sales. If you were a benchmark participant, this is only a portion of the output from the benchmark, and you will get the full set of slides as soon as it's finished, actually. Part of the follow-through on this set of data is next month's webinar, which we're calling But Wait, There's More, the SD-WAN cost model, and it will again be based on the SD-WAN portions of this research as well as some data that we've gathered from other projects, and that will be held on Tuesday, June 14th, same time as usual, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and there is a registration link on our website. It has this URL embedded in it. And with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it over to Erwin to moderate the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, John, and wonderful presentation. A couple of questions that I wanted to pass along to you. First one is, as you talked earlier in the presentation about different kinds of workloads that we're moving to public platform as a service, can you describe what you're seeing in terms of what are people putting into a public platform as a service? Is it still kind of development and storage, or are people moving more mission critical operational type applications into public Paas?
We're still seeing fairly low deployment of mission-critical stuff into IaaS and PaaS. We're definitely seeing expansion beyond test and dev, obviously. What we're seeing is folks definitely taking greater advantage of IaaS-type storage options as a back-end to things they're doing in their data centers, sort of as another tier of storage. We're seeing them take advantage of IaaS for the highly variable portions of some of their workloads. And this is the classic, bursting scenario, except that they don't just use it for bursting capacity. They move the variable workload out into the cloud, and then it can scale up and down as it needs to, but it's always resident in the cloud. It's not just being used as bursting capacity. And we see them moving things out into the cloud if they are going to be serving folks primarily outside the organization, but for non-mission critical workloads. So, these are your classic low-risk website type website type workloads, product documentation, long tail financial reporting, and archival materials of that sort. It's moving up the risk ladder, it's moving up the scale ladder, and folks are getting comfortable enough, and the economics are shifting gradually in favor of them moving some of their steady state workloads and more mission critical workloads out. They're actively planning that within the next couple of years in many cases.
Excellent. And then another follow-up question, as you talked later in the presentation about SD-WAN, and you mentioned kind of the emergence of carrier-based SD-WAN services. As you kind of think longer term in the SD-WAN space, does this continue to be a product classification that organizations go out and buy products and implement them themselves, or does SD-WAN begin to emerge more as a service?
I think ultimately, what we call SD-WAN now, in a few years, we'll just call WAN, and it will become table stakes to be able to do all of these important functions that an SD-WAN provides, to pool bandwidth, to transparently fail across connections when there's a problem, to manage the allocation of available bandwidth to traffic based on any number of decision points. All of those things will just become table stakes in the WAN. It may be 5 years from now, it may be 7, but it's pretty much inevitable as we watch the evolution of, if you look at what Cisco's WAN offerings are now, you can see that it's becoming part and parcel of what they're going to be offering ongoing. And it only makes sense that the connectivity providers will follow that same arc and make these kinds of services, again, table stakes. You can do this with an overlay, or you can do it as a managed service in much the same way you can, have a managed pool of routers now, or you can manage your own.
Yeah, that makes sense, and this is definitely has the potential to disrupt business models that are purely based on MPLS.
Yes, and from the flip side, carriers going strong in this space could seriously disrupt business models based on being an overlay.
Yeah, that's true. Excellent. Well, we don't have any more questions at this point, so go ahead and express my thank you to you for the presentation, and we'll wrap up today's webinar. Thank you to all of you who were able to attend today. Please join us again, as John mentioned, for our next follow-up webinar, but wait, there's more as we talk about our SDN cost model on Tuesday, June 14th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. We will have a registration link up on our website very soon. In addition, we will make a replay of this webinar available in about a week. If you're a client and you're interested in getting a copy of the slides, we can provide that to you as well. If you'd like to follow up with us, please contact us at client-services@nemertes.com or sales@nemertes.com if you're not a client and are interested in learning more about access to our research. Thank you very much for your time, and this concludes the webinar.
Thank you, Erwin. Goodbye, all.